Dr. Christopher Clary, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Albany, at the State University of New York, with a speciality of politics in South Asia. But on his resume, he also has the Belfer Center at Harvard University, the Rand Corporation, the Henry L. Stimson Center, the Council on Foreign Relations, so is a perfect contributor to our debate. How China's relationship in South Asia relates to its broader regional and global ambitions, what we've been talking about, and how does that reflect the broader shifts in the balance of power regionally and globally? Christopher Clary, tell us the answer to that.
Well, thank you for having me, and I enjoyed hearing the previous two presenters. I learned a lot from their presentations, and I've learned a lot from their work over the years. You know, I'm going to sound a note of cautious optimism about the ability of China to turn investment into exploitation. So I don't have any illusions about China's benign intentions, but it is difficult to both generate economic power and then use that economic power to achieve political ends. And I think China is now going through a period where it will encounter greater difficulties for a variety of reasons. You know, I'm going to make three major points today. And the first of which I want to make is the BRI emerged in a specific global and economic context, and that context is likely drawing to a close. Principally a period of time in which US and Western-led leadership had been impacted by the great financial crisis, which disproportionately influenced the United States and Europe, and had a lesser effect on China. And this gave China enormous resources, but also China was entering into a period where there had been overinvestment in domestic infrastructure and construction. And so China was uniquely interested in finding a way to advance economic stimulus. And so came up with, I think, a quite novel and interesting idea of using that excess money to stimulate, to buy things from Chinese firms by having them make investments overseas. So having gone through, 30 years after Deng Xiaoping's opening of domestic port construction, highway construction, rail construction, building construction, those firms now then took some of their energies to other states using Chinese money that had to be paid back with interest while it was employing Chinese workers. This seemed like a good deal, and also had the promise of allowing China to mitigate to some extent the Malacca dilemma it faced because of its reliance on sea lines of communication, while also perhaps tying in China's near abroad more closely to Beijing than it would otherwise in the absence of meaningful ground links, especially into Central Asia and South Asia, and then to a lesser extent, Russia. So that was the theory, and it made sense, but we're going into a period of time when I think just China's going to have less money. It's going to be less interested in using this sort of indirect stimulus package. And I won't go through all the reasons, but China itself is dealing with a property investment bubble. The experience we have in the West and in other cases is that as you unwind those property bubbles, that's going to generate economic headwinds for probably a decade under good scenarios, assuming there's not a period of acute crisis, which is possible. There's just excess capacity in the market, and Chinese investors, in the absence of a reliable welfare state and in the absence of a reliable retirement system, have placed what would otherwise go into retirement into these apartments. And in many cases, these apartments may not exist or may not be worth anything. And now that money that's generated all the problems that property bubbles generate that again, Europeans and Americans are acutely aware of because of the experiences of the last decade. China is exiting out of the period in which it has a demographic dividend. Now China is graying. The median age in China is almost exactly the same as the median age of the United States. But China has the unique problem of being a country that has grayed, has gotten old before it got wealthy. This is maybe a world unique situation, good, in a way that's good that China was able to keep its elderly population alive for so long. But now you have all these old Chinese that are around trying to figure out that are creating drains on their society. The welfare state is imperfect. That the absence of a credible and meaningful welfare state means that people have to stay at home to take care of the old people, and that then has implications for China's labor participation rate. which produces limitations on how much China can achieve economically. So you have those headwinds amidst the global geopolitical turmoil that has greeted a decade of Xi Jinping's more activist and I would say aggressive foreign policy. So, you know, that there is going to be modest decoupling with China, and that's in part because the hourly cost of a Chinese worker has reached pretty high levels compared to alternative providers in Vietnam and Southeast Asia and even in India, which has been a laggard in this regard. And that's going to also mean that net exports are going to be a less meaningful propellant to the Chinese economy than they were in the period of time from 1979 to, say, 2015. We're already, I should know, have really good reasons to believe that for the last decade, Chinese GDP statistics have been inflated. And then on top of that, because of this rise of the cost of a Chinese worker and getting widgets out of Chinese factories, there's real concerns that China may be entering into a period of that, you know, economists sometimes refer to as a middle income trap, that it can't get up the value ladder enough to wind up in a high income status. All of that means that we're, I think, going to have many years of Chinese economic growth in sort of the 4% range. Now, that will exceed probably what Europe or the US can achieve, but it may not exceed what Bangladesh, Vietnam, India can achieve. And that relative balance of economic power then will make, I think, China have less ability to fund generous BRI, but also you know, mean that some of the other states will be less interested in those Chinese investments. And you should say all of this is true even if you're not optimistic about India's growth prospects, but it is at least plausible that you could have a very long period of accelerated Indian economic growth. Even if you don't buy into sort of the most optimistic takes of the Modi regime supporters, it is, you know, over the next decade, 2 decades, you could have 6% economic growth in India, exceeding the Chinese number. And that means India will have more money to invest in this near abroad, creating another financial alternative to Chinese investment and debt that wasn't present in the previous decade of 2010 to 2020. So the period of like kind of peak BRI could be passing us by, and other forms of financing might be available, and that will minimize the ability for China to turn investment into exploitation. The second line of argument that I want to focus on today has been hinted at a little bit by Christine, but I want to draw it out a little bit more, which is large outside economic, social, or political pressure on any society generates antibodies to that pressure. Nationalism remains the most powerful force in international politics, and it is hard for states to turn leverage into political changes that are favorable to them without locals being quite upset. So, you know, as China's own memories of a century of humiliation demonstrates, external economic intervention can quickly become to be perceived as exploitation, and those nationalist responses will limit the ability for exploitation to really secure political ends. And Christine mentioned, and I also have noted repeatedly in the press for the last decade, stories of Chinese citizens misbehaving overseas. When you have large expatriate populations, they get into trouble. They get in trouble with the law. They get in trouble in Muslim societies trying to buy pork, trying to do other things that Christine was mentioning. They get into traffic accidents. They run over people. They want to not be held accountable by local laws. And all of that pisses people off. And the US has been the recipient of that anger for many years, but it is not the only state where these dynamics in play. And China will not be immune. And Chinese expatriates have not proven a great willingness to integrate and blend into the societies in which they're operating. And very large investment footprints with engineers and construction workers are not the sort of things that are going to be ignored by locals. So these investments are all going into societies that have pre-existing political cleavages on partisan, ethnic, linguistic, or religious grounds. And locally, there is acute concern that Chinese investments are favoring other groups. And so it exacerbates these pre-existing cleavages and makes Chinese investment a political football. And there are finite resources, even for a state like China, and they cannot manage these things perfectly. So, already in societies that have large Chinese debt holdings, we see signs of backlash. And I think that will only get worse, especially if China does not improve its reputation as being a more magnanimous donor than it has been thus far. So, we did some polling in Punjab province in Pakistan in 2018, my co-authors and I, and we just asked, do you know about CPEC? Everybody really, to first approximation, 75-80% of the Punjabi respondents knew about CPEC, at least a little bit. And then we asked, well, what do you think it will do? What do you think it will improve the Pakistani economy? Well, many of them did, majority did, in fact. But maybe 40% were worried. About 33% of the sample thought that it would improve the Pakistani economy, but would allow China to dominate the Pakistani economy. And then another, 7-8% or so thought that it might not even improve the Pakistani economy in the process. So when you have a minority, but a substantial minority, skeptical of investments, and I should emphasize, as Christine, I think, alluded to, Punjab province, in a way, is going to be the most supportive of any of Pakistan's large population centers of a thing like CPEC, compared to poor Shia communities in Gilgit and Baltistan, or in other marginalized communities in Balochistan or Sindh or in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So these antibodies will generate backlash, and we've seen targeted attacks on China in Pakistan, and I think will continue. And Christine talked a little bit about the Islamic State in Afghanistan. I think that will be a problem that China will have to contend with. And as you deal with it, does China decide to do a greater security force presence? Well, that will also generate backlash, as the U.S. knows from decades of being a global power. There's an old line that if you owe the bank $100,000, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $1 million or $1 billion, and that's the bank's problem. And China has to contend with that as well. It can't allow these states to default on its investments. It may have riders in the contract that give it access to port revenue. Those are actually quite hard to enforce without going through some sort of colonialism. And colonialism is not normatively acceptable in the modern era. It's going to be hard for them to actually do it in practice. You're not going to invade a country to make sure they pay their port revenues. This isn't like the Marines aren't going to Haiti to collect the custom houses anymore. I don't think China will be doing that in the country. So a lot of these riders, I think, are going to be unenforceable in practice. And these antibodies are going to be something that China has to contend with. The U.S. has a lot of trouble turning its financial leverage into meaningful political outcomes. And I don't think China is going to be much, much better than other great powers have been historically. Okay. The reason I am cautiously optimistic is because I do think there are real limitations that do emerge from Chinese investment overseas. And that's my third line of inquiry, which is that multipolarity, and you could maybe even imagine bipolarity. You might think that China is much stronger, much economically more important than the next most important great power. But when there are contending great powers that will give states options that they are going to want to try to navigate and exploit. Now, they may, regional or minor powers may be too clever by half. They may think they can exploit great power enmity more than they can. Frederick alluded to this possibility in his comments, but it is going to give states options. And that principally means that the Western-led international community is probably going to have less leverage to deal with troublesome states than it did during the period of peak Western coercive ability, which was in the 1990s. So troublesome states, the Myanmars, Afghanistan of the world, that are not necessarily avowed everyday enemies of the Western-led order, like North Korea or Iran, those troublesome states are going to have options, and it will be difficult for the U.S. to build a crushing sanctions regime to punish them for atrocities they may commit at home, human rights violations they may commit at home, illiberties that they may take with their citizens. U.S. leverage to deal with that will be less, because the U.S. Both objectively has less relative influence, because they can go to China, they can go to India, which may have different sets of normative concerns in these places, and they can go conceivably, depending on the aftermath of the Ukraine war, to Russia to get financing. And so it will be hard for the U.S. to push these states in the same to the degree that it did in the 1990s. And then the US, for its own part, will probably hold its fire, maybe more than it should. US officials are quite wary of using the levers that they have. Seems like I get emotional about this, but that's not true. And they are worried once they pull a lever, it will no longer be available to them. They're especially worried about pushing states into adversary camps. And that's going to restrain US willingness to use the coercion that it has at its fingertips. And that will just make life easier for undemocratic regimes to do bad things at home and abroad. That is a real constraint of China's rise in this move to multipolarity, but that is a function of the system rather than any Chinese strategy. That's just what multipolarity does. And there will be occasions in which the intensity of great power disputes leads to proxy competitions. Those could be violent, or those could be through political shenanigans. You know, the minor powers are going to be wary of that. Nobody wants to be Mossadegh or Arbenz or Bao Dai, right? No one wants to invite a great power competition that could overthrow the political elements in their countries. But that does happen. Miscalculations do occur in that way. So all of that, those three lines of analysis, that the Chinese economy is likely to grow at a much lower rate than it did for the prior 3 decades, that Chinese influence is likely to generate local antibodies, but that multipolarity will give bad regimes options that they did not have in prior decades. All of that leads me to the cautious optimism that I tried to convey here today. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for that, Christopher Clary. It seemed, I mean, just encapsulating it, which you've just done, the superpowers will be less super powerful, both of them, than they are, and Russia as well. Which brings me to 2 questions that have come in that I'll group together. One from Dr. KK Ubdahai. Does the debt trap diplomacy narrative hold water, given that nations such as Sri Lanka have a problem with debt management? This is the internal governance of these countries. But then Jugendra Patak says, given India's historic ties and influence with countries such as Maldives, Bangladesh and Nepal, how easy would it be for China to extend its own influence into these countries? Could you give us an encapsulation of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, overnight, it looks like the Sri Lankan government was able to give assurances from China to the IMF that it would restructure some of the debt that China has provided to Sri Lanka historically. And that is, I think, a sign that the international financial institutions are aware of this problem, right? Like the IMF and the World Bank don't want to get in the business of bailing out Chinese loans, allowing China to reap a high interest rates. And they are not, they may not be perfect, but they're aware of this problem and they're going to put pressure on it. And it's going to be difficult for countries, especially countries like Sri Lanka, which the international community some countries are too big to fail. And there's lots of countries like Sri Lanka where the international community are fine with letting them go through a period of acute hardship. And those countries aren't going to be able to manipulate the Western financial institutions into extraordinarily generous packages. Now, there are states like Pakistan that are going to be better at maneuvering in that space. But the number of those countries, that, especially those that don't have like nuclear weapons, is a pretty small list. But I do think part of the reason, that negotiations with Sri Lanka have gone better is because India and the United States have similar concerns about Chinese influence. And that will, I think, constrain what China can do, especially if India grows. Now, it is tough to know what is going to go off the Indian growth story. The Indian government, I think, is excessively optimistic about the prospects there. But Chinese headwinds are real, and India will be a beneficiary of international investors skeptical of China. And that means the relative economic balance of power is going, I think, to probably favor India over a 10 or 20-year time horizon. India won't be a larger economy than China, but it'll be larger in relative terms. And that means that the influence is, I think, we had this period of kind of peak influence in the 2010s that I think is fading.